So let's just start. First things first. The first thing that I would do is look for a grain line, because from that point you can work out from your grain line. Generally, you can see a grain line within a garment. Even if the grain is not that obvious, even if you just detract your eye a little bit from it, you're always going to be able to pick a sense of where the grain line is. With most standard garments, say for example this jacket, you will find that the grain line, of course, will be along the center front, because it would be very unusual for this jacket, which is cut in a very conventional way, to not have a straight of grain right down your center front. And your center front will be identified by the 3 buttons. So starting with something like this, you start off with your center front. And you can even do this I would start off by drawing it out. And then working out from this line. So we know that that is our grain line. We can pop the 3 buttons straight down that line. First thing, pin that down. Okay, now as you can see, this is not going to lie flat the whole time. We're going to find that there's always, when one bit is flat, the next bit is not flat. And this is the first problem that people run into and think, how on earth am I actually going to take the pattern from this, because I can't get this one panel to stay flat. So the way to combat that problem is to start from a corner. So we're starting from the center front line, and we're smoothing this out without stretching it in any way. Just getting it to sit flat. It actually doesn't matter also if this panel goes underneath and points, as long as you're not precious about when you're tracing through that you might damage that panel. So again, if it's not leather or it's not a fabric like a fine nylon or something that is likely to be damaged, I mean, this being a wool suiting, if this is actually new and hasn't got burred ends or is sharp enough, you won't do any damage if that were to be under there, if that were easier for you to then trace through this way. But let's just say that it's a precious garment and you don't want to damage it in any way. You would be best to keep this within the perimeter of the seams, in which case it's always a good practice to keep the other panels out of the way. Now, it doesn't matter what the rest of the garment is doing, because at the moment that's not important to us. What's important is we're starting with this panel and we're wanting to get the information just from this panel. It often helps also if you keep the paper at a very similar size to the rest of, to the actual shape of the panel that you're cutting. Because this way you're not wrestling with all of this paper when you're trying to pin this down. Because otherwise, as you can imagine, trying to lift all of that as we're trying to pin at this point here is going to become quite a difficult exercise. If anybody has questions as we go along, please ask, because, I mean, we'll cover quite a lot. And sorry, no?
No, I was
okay.
Sorry.
So if something comes to mind that you see me doing and you have a question, then just ask straight away and then we can cover it. It's all actually valuable for the lesson, so don't be shy. Okay. Now, it's not a perfect science, because you're dealing with something that's designed to curve around the human figure. Obviously, there's going to be seams in it, and there's going to be shape in it that's been introduced, and there's also going to be ease. All garments will have ease in some way or another. Well, not all, but certainly tailored garments will have ease in one area or another. So you're going to find that even once you've got this pattern drawn out, it may not exactly match the next panel that you trace off when you put the pieces together at the end. That will be the next exercise in sort of cleaning these lines up. But in the interest of being as accurate as possible for now, really all you can do is try and get it as flat within the area that you're tracing off as you possibly can. Does that all make sense so far? Right, so first of all, it's obvious that you can do an outer edge to begin with. Now remember, any marks that go on now, the more accurate the better, but it is a case of dot to dot. So if we are clear where this edge is and this edge is by a few lines, then that's fine. We can fill in the rest with a set square and clean everything up at the end. The same with this. You don't necessarily need to trace the whole way around this whole pocket because we understand that this pocket is straight. So use your sort of common sense as to what information you would actually need for this. You can either do it with that or you can do it with this. This, I think, is marginally more brutal because it's a heavier point that you're having to drive through quite a few layers of fabric. And say, for example, this area of a garment is actually not the strongest place in the world, so driving that through it may well do some damage if you're not careful. Whereas if you're tracing wheel up to that point, and then you're tracing wheel just at the end of this point, again, you don't even need to get into those points because we know when we draw this at the end, those points will become clear. So with what I've just said, we just then trace down the side seam. And still keeping the arm curve flat as we can. We try and get this as accurate as we can. We're probably going to find when we trace this one off, inevitably that this and this don't match exactly, but that's quite all right because between the two, we're going to be able to fathom what the curve of the arm is. There's a certain amount of interpretation at the end that's required with something like this. I can't stress that enough because it can be a little disheartening when you get to the end and you realize that all the pieces don't match up exactly, but that is normal. Okay, so I've put a point right at the end of this seam where this is still flat, this is flat. And then again, you don't necessarily have to trace the whole way around the underarm curve, but the more that you can and the more accurate you can be about it, just making sure that the fabric is out of your way as you do so, the better. At this point, you can also mark where the seam from the sleeve arrives. So that's here, let's see. Now I'm going to do this relatively accurately within reason, but I'm not going to labor it too long because we only have an hour and a half and there's a lot I'd like to show you. So let's just sort of race through this a little. Right, now we get to this point. We've got all that really clean and accurate. Now what do we do with the rest? Does anybody have any ideas on how we can now get to this section? Close. But bearing in mind that we've arrived here, so we've drawn through to there, and we've drawn up to there. So we don't really want to move either of these 2 points, because, or in fact, any of this fabric here, because the moment we start moving any of that, we may well distort all the angles. So it's important at this point, to be fair, I should actually have pinned this down first, before tracing. So let's just say that had been done. So what we can do now, all of these, sorry, let's leave those for a moment. You can, again, if you're confident that the pin is clean and that it's not going to damage the fabric, you can put another securing pin there. So now we know that straight along here and straight along here, that point at which we're now going to pivot the rest from is really controlled. It's staying exactly where you want it to stay. If you're at all concerned about it, you can possibly put a few more in. If it's a fabric that you really can't do this, then you may just have to be a little bit more thorough with pins down here and maybe one in through here just so you know that the whole thing is relatively secure. Then what we want to do is we need to remove anything that will stop us now straightening this, apart from this line here. So in this case, because we have this one, we can pretty much just leave those three and maybe this one as well. And what will happen is as we straighten that, the rest of this will bend. But that's fine, we have the information we need. Okay? If you want to be even more careful and thorough about it, you could even document this line along here. But it won't be of a great deal of benefit to you unless there's a line that you can see in the garment. Okay? Now, you may still find that you can't get it straight, in which case you need to take another bite at it. All the while, you can also check with your grain line, which should be true with the grain line that is the center front here. And if it's not, then you know that this is still distorting. So it's always a matter of cross-referencing these other points of reference as well. And we can see pretty clearly, I don't know if we can see it on the screen so much, but you can see quite clearly on this garment. Can everybody see that? I don't know if you can really see it on the screen. If anybody wants to come a little bit closer, you can actually see that there's quite a pronounced grain line. And if you want to identify what that grain line is as a point of reference, again, make sure if it's a garment that you don't want to damage, that your pins are clean. You could run them through a clean piece of cloth first, just to make sure that you haven't accidentally dropped them on the floor and got some dirt on them, and you're going to leave a little dot on your favorite white blazer, for example. But let's just say that is the grain line that we've established. You can then, as you go into this next step, you can measure this point to the grain, or you can draw another supporting grain line further out. That means you don't have to move the garment. So say, for example, so we know because this is parallel to our center front grain line, we know that this is still the correct grain line. So once we've measured what it is from here, say it's 12.7, we know that when we flatten this, in theory, this should be 12.7. You see at the moment it's 13.2. So we know in actual fact, do you see how much discrepancy there actually is? And that will affect the angle here, here. It'll affect the shape of your revers at the end. It actually affects the whole top of the garment. And when you're talking 5 millimeters in a jacket, that's really a lot. That's enough for it to just not fit in the way that you like the way this jacket fitted when you were in, I don't know, Oxfam, and you found it and you put it on and you thought, wow, that's great. I like it just the front, just the way it is. You'll lose a lot of that if you don't take special care with these points, because as you go, it all adds up. So you lose a little bit more and a little bit more. It's quite often a case of just having to readjust and readjust each time until you get it exactly where it needs to be. Also with tailored garments such as these, quite often there is a dart in here, so there will be a shape that's created by the dart. This is another thing you need to compensate for. And generally you can do that by feeling the dart inside, so you can feel how much has been sewn in. Also by looking at how much the grain line is distorted, for example, and that will tell you how many centimeters that dart has been pulled in. And this is something else that you will need to then make allowance for. I should really have an example for you. I mean, this one's very hard to see. But you can feel the amount of grain of seam allowance that's inside. So you can at least calculate proportionately that it will not have been taken in probably much more than the grain line, than the amount of seam allowance will allow there, because this goes to a dart. So this will be opened probably to about the width of the seam allowance that you have in there, which is roughly 1 centimetre. So that's an added complication. In this particular case, you would need to put an awl or a pin through. Let's do it to the side. So imagine that we had the dart there. You would need to first draw this, just as we had before, here, here, up to there, and then you need to make an allowance for what has been taken in here. And the way that you do that is you hold that there, and let's say that was 1 centimetre, we've decided that it's been taken in. You need to swing that over, the whole thing over 1 centimetre before you do the rest. Does that all make sense? Are we following? Some people are, some people not. No, because I think there's 5 mil in each side there, and I'd be surprised if it was more than 5 mil seam allowance each side, because it's a reasonably straight men's jacket. So I guess that from some point is just from experience of knowing roughly how much that would be. But without you knowing that for sure, you're quite possibly going to have to find another way of establishing that, and you may find the grain line on the back of the garment will help you with this. If you look at the cloth here, you can see that there's actually quite a distinct grain line. So you could pin through at right angles to that grain line, which would mean you'd have to get behind this lining. It does get a little bit tricky, but if you had, let's just say you did that, and you identified this as the grain line here, let's just say it was a little more extreme like that, just for the interests of a lesson. And then, of course, this one is straight again with the center front. So, with that in mind, you would go from the topmost point. I mean, I've made this far more extreme than it would be, just so we can see clearly. So you would say, so you could say from the topmost point of the dart here, from there to there is 13.2, and from the bottommost point of the dart, we would say is 10. So by process of elimination, we would see then that there's 3.2 centimetres that has disappeared between that point and that point, which would indicate to us that this has been taken in 3.2 centimetres. Is everybody following that? Yeah? You can use that on any dart, any time. This is a good time for us to be able to look at it because it's quite a straightforward area, but where shapes are a bit more complicated, on skirts and quite complex curves, you can identify, even if a dart is not necessarily just a straight dart, whether it's actually got a curve to it or there's a shape in it, or whether actually maybe it's a seam that starts off as a dart and then is cut open into a seam. So it starts off straight and then it goes off in a shape like that, which could be a dart which starts here and curves into a seam up here on something more complex as a garment. All right? The best way to be able to tell exactly what that shape is doing is, again, to find your grain line and measure out from the dart. That will give you all the information you need. It's basically just this over and over again. So this is quite important. So if anybody's not completely clear, let me know. Yeah? What's that? You're not completely clear. Okay. So we are not completely sure because the seam allowance is open at the back on each side of this. We somehow want to work out how much is missing. So say, for example, it could be just a fractional amount like that. That's then these two edges have been put together, or it could be dramatically more. But we're really not sure how much this quantity is. So the best way to tell how much this quantity is to look at how much the grain line has been distorted. So if this is our grain line there, when this was originally cut out, this would have been at exactly parallel to this one. Do you see? So when we measure from here and then we measure from here, we can tell how much has disappeared at that point. And that gives us how big that is right there.
So it's how much has been added on that's made it no longer parallel?
Taken off, yeah, how much has been cut out. Because being a dart, this as a flat pattern will have something missing like that, and it could be a tiny amount or it could be a really big amount. It could be anything in between. Now the more accurate you can be with finding a grain line, the easier it is for you to then identify how much is missing in there. And that immediately gives you the sense of volume up here. So obviously for a women's blazer, it's going to be much more extreme here. It's going to be much more like that. For a men's, it's just going to be very gentle shaping over the chest. So it's going to be a very small dart, such as that.
Would it not be a diamond shape?
It would be a diamond if we then continued down to the hem.
Okay.
Because at this point, we're coming into the waist. So at that point, we're still at the widest point of where a dart would be. But then if we continue this back out again, our hips are arriving somewhere down here. So this, you're absolutely right, then this would go back on itself this way. And it would normally not be a really sharp diamond. It would normally be a little bit softer, more of an ellipse like that, because we don't obviously want it to be.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
How do you, like, I guess, like, how do you pin it? Because I see it goes like that way.
Yeah,
Do you follow one line or?
Exactly. You look for your grain line. Now, I've not done this accurately. You can see that that's not really on an exact grain line, but it was just so that we could really see how potentially extreme the difference is. But you see how you can just read a grain line in there? You can just sort of see.
Yeah.
So you're needing to follow that as accurately as you can within reason. And I mean, if you look really carefully, you can see that it's kind of coming down here and then going off.
Yeah, it's like going that way.
Yeah, so it's much less than this, but it will be about 2 centimeters there. And if you really can't read it on this side, then my suggestion would be that you could maybe read it on the back side, because you see how you can see a grain line quite accurately here. And this is a surge, or a drill. So it will actually have exactly 45 degree surge running from one angle to the other. So another way that you can do it is once you've identified where that surge line is, and you can read that actually much more accurately than this grain here, because grain is a bit ambiguous. It feels like it's a bit like the sea. It's not, before you know it, you're on another line. Whereas this, you can read it very accurately, you see. So what you can do, if you can open this, or if you can some way get behind it, or maybe you're lucky enough that the garment is not lined, quite often it's not, then you can first identify this 45 degree surge, and then you can use that to draw your grain line off, because it will be 45 degrees to an exact grain line. Is everybody clear with that? Mm-hmm. Grain line is really important here because it's always going to identify what angle panels are at, and that will always identify just how much fullness is somewhere, what angle is cut away from another seam. Really crucial. So any way that you can find a grain line accurately is really important to you right now. And this is also really useful when you're cross-referencing it at the end, because if you can find the grain very carefully and you can put a tracing wheel line through it, and then you move up to the next bit and you put a tracing wheel line through that. So say, as we were saying with this one here, as we've moved up to this next piece, if you want to keep documenting it with grain lines as you go, at the end when you take it all off, you're going to have a series of lines. You can very quickly see which of those lines are not matching other lines. And you can tell at which points this is not actually quite straight. And once you've identified that it's not quite straight, you can reassess the length. So say from here to here and from there to there. You may find, oh, I've lost a bit of length there and the grain does this slightly. And then it's very clear that what's happened is you've simply lost length in the pattern there. So you will need to then cut the pattern open at that point and open it until that grain line becomes straight again. And then you will most probably get the original length that it was, say, in the side seam. Does that all make sense as well? These are all things that you will be able to work out and cross-reference once the garment is off the paper and once you have a rough and relatively accurate tracing, but not completely accurate. It's very, very, very common for you to then have to start adjusting it and using this garment as your reference for measuring, for reassessing the grain line, for looking at what that dart could be, maybe putting it on the stand and seeing how much volume there is in the bust or around the hips, and so on. Okay? Anyway, so let's get back to where we were here.
How do you assess how long or how wide something is in relation to, say, if you've got padded fabric or really thick fabric?
Well,
sometimes
it's
you need extra length in order to cover.
yeah, that's a very good time. It's a very good time to ask this because that's exactly what's happening here. We have a shoulder pad, and you can feel that it's, you know, there's a bit of getting through to the paper to get the information down. I think what you're talking about though is something that may be a padded garment which has a larger outer shell. Is that right? Or
Could be, or it could be a short.
yeah.
Just in general, how would you deal with if you have something that's really thick, but you're getting the outer layer?
So in effect, the fabric's slightly curving over it. To some degree, you can compensate for that, and you can a little bit calculate if it's quite an extreme curve over a shape that you really can't get flat. You're going to have to make allowance for how much bigger it will be at the outermost, or sorry, the innermost curve of that. So say, for example, it's a bit bigger here. The way that will have actually been achieved actually is exactly the way the ease on a sleeve has been achieved. And actually, I think we should, let me just get to this point and then we'll have a look at that, because this is a very good way of answering your question, and it's something that you will really need to know, not only for sleeves, but wherever there may be ease required in a garment, and that is to create more volume on one panel than the panel it's going into, which I think is sort of what you're talking about. This is not a particularly precious garment to me, obviously, so I'm just putting this in to really hold it flat. But I leave it to you when you're working with something to govern just how careful you need to be. But then you can continue up and so on. You can get to the next point and then you can release these. Again, you've checked your grain line, you've traced through your grain line. You would have had it traced down there. You can now release this one because you have the next series of points holding it. And you see, then you can get this completely flat. So we've made it to the top. Again, the grain line, you move up that grain line and check again. So we can see this is really clear and identifiable as a grain. And again, it's too far over, so we need to bring that over this way. It's exactly it there. Pin that down to hold it. Now, the next thing you're probably going to find in a place like this is there's a slight ease in this. You see how that's a little bit full? And that's the very reason that you talked about, is that it's slightly going over the curve of the shoulder pad. Now, that's not necessarily always the case in a jacket, but in this particular case, you can see that it's actually happening. So in some way, shape, or form, you need to compensate for that. And in this particular case, the way I would is just push that ease up as far as you can at a point where you still can. And that's before that seam, because obviously once you're at that seam, it's been drawn in. But at this point here, it's not yet been drawn in. Do you see? we can get really quite close to that seam, but not quite to it. And that's the most important part for us to mark something through. So you can hold it or you can pin it, whatever way you feel comfortable. Check it until you're happy, and then you can run this straight through. Now, what you can do next is then draw the rest of the sleeve curve. Again, you would need to pull the sleeve as far out of the line of fire as you can, so you can really get into that seam. And bear in mind that we're not needing, with this one, to go right to that point, because we've got to the point that we needed to identify. It'll just continue going straight, and then we know how much that's eased in. All right? Now, the next thing we need to look at is where this particular seam goes in here. So, because this is a bespoke collar, this has just been lapped, I would say, 1 centimetre over. Generally, if you were looking at, say, for example, a less bespoke without a Melton wool back, you'll have a far more accurate seam to follow. All right? So in this particular case, you would then just trace along that line and up to this point, and then you have it. You can't really see it on the screen so much. In this particular one, we can actually have a look at this side perhaps. And we can see, yeah, it's 1 centimetre. So we know that this will continue 1 centimetre past and 1 centimetre past up here.
Well, isn't that centimetre considered seam allowance?
It is, yeah.
Like
That's,
we didn't think about the seam allowance on the center front or on the bottom.
yeah. No, that's true, but it's still good to know, because that's in actual fact, that would help us. Actually, yeah, I mean, I guess it's not crucial, but it's certainly useful for you to know the construction.
But would we
But-
mark them both lines, like the actual seam and the seam allowance, or just?
I think up here I would probably be inclined to. You don't need to anywhere else, because then you can put your seam allowance in afterwards. But in this particular case, I mean, if you're wanting to work out what the construction of this is and how much this was overlapped, then it would probably pay also to draw your seam allowance in to remind yourself, because then when you look at this garment, you might think, was it 5 mil or was it 1 centimetre, and did I calculate for that when I drew it, did I not? It might actually be better just to trace it on now, but that's really up to you. So you would come through.
Sorry, Phil, can we just centre it up to the screen a little bit? Is it possible to centre it up to the screen?
Oh.
A bit more centre.
Like
Just so that people can zoom in.
more in the
Yeah.
more in the centre. You mean? Yeah, we're kind of going a bit off. Aren't we? Okay. Right. So now we can take this off.